Thank you, Kerry, and good to be here again. We'll go for probably about an hour or so on the production meeting, and then this afternoon, if you need GAP, we'll do a GAP training after lunch. But on production here, I'm going to talk a little bit about last year's season, and then going into this coming year. Of course, last year we had a good early season dry. We got a little bit dry up in July for a couple of weeks, and then we got real wet in August, and that was the case. I don't know about so much up here, but further south of here, we had a lot of rainfall in August. You know, one of the wettest Augusts we've seen in a while, which on your bigger tobacco doesn't like that kind of wet conditions very good. So this is a year where soil drainage plants was a major factor. We talk about if you got a choice about putting tobacco on the better drained soils to do that, and this is a year last year when that really showed. You know, where you had you could really see a big difference in the better drained soils from those that weren't as well drained when you get 10 inches of rain up in August. Sometimes varieties respond differently to that kind of rainfall. And of course, black shank does too. We saw in some cases some fields that had some history of black shank way back years ago, but didn't expect to see it this year, and then got into quite a bit this past year when you got that much rain. So we'll talk about that a little bit too, and about varieties, about fungicides a little bit. There is a new variety and a new fungicide for black shank that we'll talk about. This is a field from Caldwell County outside of Princeton, where again this field had, years ago, probably 15, 20 years ago, there was a little bit of black shank in this field, but hadn't seen any. It's been in a good rotation for a long time. I didn't expect to see any black shank. And when you look at this, this got about 9.5 inches of rain in August over about 2.5 weeks in August, and you think that's just water damage and wet feed. But when you get to looking closer, this is mostly all black shank in here, and in this part of this field, really ended up losing most of this. This was 7302 was the variety here, which is not just black shank. This is race 1 black shank, it would tell you, because 7302 has just got resistance to race 0, and so anyway, it's a field that wasn't expected to see much black shank, but got quite a bit. If you get that much water, it kind of brought it out of its dormancy, you might say. This is another field from Muhlenberg County. Had over 10 inches of rain in August, and this was nearly Meadow, again a field that may have had a little touch of black shank back in here, 15, 20 years ago, but then you set an early field, wasn't expecting to see black shank, and got a lot of black shank loss when you get that kind of rain up over 10 inches over about 3 weeks in August. Now this one plant up here that's standing up and looking pretty good is actually KTD8. This is one of the situations where this was actually, I think, a reset that was sitting there, and about the only plant that survived. Everything else in this part of this field pretty much died to black shank. It wasn't wet feed; it was actual black shank. So it kind of brings up the question: it's pretty tough to know, where you got black shank and where you don't in some cases, because this is a couple of fields here didn't expect to see any, and saw quite a bit if you get that kind of late season rainfall. So more important about if there's any chance of black shank having something that's got some pretty good resistance there, it seems, if you get that kind of conditions late in the season. So variety guide, and I might get Kerry to, if you hadn't already got your production guide, we've got production guides in the back, and of course there's a whole chapter in there about burley varieties, a whole chapter about dark varieties too, and got this chart in there, and then a lot of the information about varieties, but nothing new for burley. We've got a lot of choices for burley, but as far as black shank is concerned, the KT209 is still our best black shank resistant variety. It's a 10 to race 0, and it's an 8 to race 1, and so it's by far our best, and probably it may be about the best we'll ever see as far as black shank resistance there, because it's at least for race 1, it's going to be tough to get full resistance like you get for race 0 in these. So again, 10 and an 8, 209. if you got a hot black shank field, that's definitely one to think about trying. The 210 is one that has got some strong race 1 resistance too, and also has some good fusarium wilt resistance. That's something we see up in this area when you get further north to up towards Owensboro, along the Green River, and some of the sandier soils. We do see once in a while some fusarium wilt. So when you think about fusarium wilt, you're talking about, you got 14L8, which is probably the best one we have for fusarium. But again, if you got fusarium, RIS plus race 1 black shank, 14L8 is not one you want to think about because it's got no race 1 resistance there. But other ones like NC7 have some good resistance to fusarium, as well as the 210 and also the 212. The 212 is really it's kind of taking the place, you might say, or at least an alternative to 14L8, being early. So something early. We don't have many early maturing varieties, but the 212 is just as early as is 14L8. And a lot of the same kind of growth characteristics too. Probably some of the same kind of sucker growth potential on the 212 as you would see with 14L8 there. But the earliness is the biggest thing about it. And plus, it's got some race 1 black shank resistance, which 14L8 did not have. So that's the biggest advantage about it. It's got the early maturity, but has some protection against race 1 black shank. Not as good as a 204 or 206 or the other KT varieties, but at least some resistance to race 1. If you're looking at just sheer yield potential, probably something like Clay's 404 down here is one that in our trial at Princeton has been the top yielder in about the last 5 out of 7 years, but no black shank resistance there. NC7's a big yielder too. It got some decent black shank resistance, but it's got a pretty big stalk, and it's really late maturity. If you've grown NC7 before, you know that. But it's one that's a big yield in tobacco, but it also feels pretty heavy when you pick it up. It's going to feel heavier than does 404, but it doesn't yield back to 404. A lot of questions about the new Rickard variety out here, the HB 4488. That one's been a pretty good quality variety that's got some good black shank resistance too, about like the 212 has got, except later maturity in it. But we've seen some good yield and good quality with this HB 4488. You all may have tried that, look at that already. This will be the second year I think we've had that available. So birdie varieties, it's always better to look at these variety trials over several trials or several years or several locations to get a better idea about how these perform against each other. If you look at one trial, that's good if it's in your county, but a lot of times if you're looking at how they'll do under different conditions, it's better to look at them over a series of trials or over years where you got some different conditions there. This is a 3-year average of our Burley commercial variety trial we do at Princeton every year, and this is from 2011 to 2013 as far as the 3-year average. And if you look at this is about 15 varieties, and from lowest to highest, I've got the highest yielding here on the far left and the lowest on the far right, but you're talking about 350 pounds difference here from lowest to highest as you compare these over a 3-year average. Now the 404, again, it would be our top yielder most every year, and over time it shows NC7 up there pretty close too, but a bigger stalk size on NC7 than on the 404. This 7371 is one that's pretty mixed. If you look at our data from back prior to 2011, you'll see that 7371 would have been one of the lower yielding varieties, but in the last 3 years, they have changed something about that and has done a whole lot better. But before that, it was one that was a pretty low yielding variety, but it has changed. The 4488 has done well yield-wise. 14L8 has done well. Then you go on down there, you get into like 129 is probably our lowest yielder, but still only about 350 pounds difference from lowest to highest. Now, in terms of quality, I've always said that if we're comparing these varieties, for barley, and they're all grown in the same field, set at the same time, if all things are equal, and we all cut them at the same time, and we cure them in the same barn, you won't see a whole lot of differences in the quality of barley. And if you look at individual trials, you'll see even less than this. But what this is we get all these plots graded. Each stalk position of each plot will get graded, and we convert those grades to this grade index, this number here, and that allows us to compare them against each other. And so the higher the number would be higher quality. And so again, looking at this, you're talking about a 60 versus a 69 here. Not a whole lot of difference there, but some. Tennessee 90, if you had to pick one that may be the higher quality, on average it might be that one there, but also 204 is, pretty close. A lot of these are up in there, 66 to 69, and you go on down there. 04P is, that's a little bit lower. NC7 is a little bit lower there, but that's really isn't much of a difference there when you really compare it and look at these. If all things, most time what you're seeing, if you look at differences in the quality for burley or for dark air cured tobacco, a lot of times it's on the time of harvest. If we're cutting air cured tobacco up in October, chances are, regardless of what the variety is, it's not going to do as well as if it were cut by mid-September. If you got a lot of acres, it's hard to get it all cut by then, but on average, in most years, you stand a better chance of getting better air curing conditions if you can get them cut by the middle of September. About 1 out of 4 or 5 years, you'll have a year where it'll stay warm up into October, and it'll do pretty well. But most of the time, you'll see a little bit lesser quality the later we cut air cured tobacco. Now, one on-farm burley trial we had up around Owensboro this past year that really had some really good yield in this one. This one didn't get quite all the water in August like a lot of other places did. It had some pretty good moisture throughout the season, but not too much late in the season. This one had, I don't have it listed here, but it's got the 4488 as one of the varieties in there. Then we had the 404, the NC7, about all the KTs in 14LA. This was cut September the 12th, so in that time where it tends to see better quality. This was 6,500 plants today. Somebody asked me last night about burley populations, and if you increase population, you're going to increase yield per acre, but you decrease yield per plant. And of course, with tobacco, we're still talking about this is a hand harvested plant. That the more plants you put out there, the more you got to cut and handle and spike and strip and all that. So, really, what I've seen, and we hadn't done a whole lot of work on population, done some, is 6,500 is probably, I would say is a good burley population for me, because it's something that if you compare 6,500 to 7,000, I think the yield difference will be pretty minimal there. But you got 500 more plants to deal with at 7,000. If you compare 6,500 to 6,000 or to 5,500, you'll see a bigger yield increase there than you would going from 6,500 to 7,000. As far as crop throw, a lot of folks ask about, well, if you increase population up there to 7,000, do you get more tips or more flies? And we don't really see that until you get probably up about 8,000 or more is what it takes to really see a lot of differences in the crop throw. But again, 6,500, that's just, in my opinion, that's a good population for burley. 7,000 is pretty good too, but you really don't see enough of an increase in the yield to probably justify the extra labor that you might have in the extra plants. But in this plot here, again, this was, had great yield, averaged about 3,500 pounds to the acre across all 8 or 9 of these varieties here. Our top yielder was the 404, and it actually went over 4,000 pounds here in this for this plot. Now, again, when you look at these small plot trials compared to large plot, farm averages on pound. We're talking about here, we've got 4 replications of these plots. Each plot is 2 rows, about 50 foot long. So we're talking about each plot is about 50 plants, and then you got 4 of them, so you got 200 plants. And we're assuming in here that you got a whole acre that's just like them 200 plants were cut on. That's a pretty big assumption. But it is, it's a pretty good, I think, a pretty good estimate about what these will do. But it's hard to really get that kind of yield if you look at it on a full acre a lot of times. But these trials do give us, indications about true differences in the yield potential. I wouldn't say you would expect 4,000 pounds off of Clay's 404 every time for sure, but this is, based on those 200 plants that we got. If you had a whole acre like that, that's what it would yield. But a lot of these in here did well. Everything over about 3,200 or so. NC7 did good. The 4488 did well too. This is one experimental that I don't know a whole lot about. This KT3370 that is probably 2 or 3 years down the road. It'll probably be comparable to a 209 for black shank resistance, and there may be some added fusarium wilt resistance, I think, in that one too. But that'll be one that'll be a couple of years down the road for sure. Okay, dark varieties. We're still increasing the numbers of dark varieties, and we're up to about 18 or 19 now. There's a chapter on these in the production guide too, just like we have for the burley. But the one new variety that we have for this year for dark is down here at the very bottom. It's called KTD14, and that one there is going to be our best black shank resistance ever that we've ever seen for dark tobacco. It's a 10 to race 0, and it's a 5 to race 1. The next best thing for air cured would probably be like a 7319, which is a 10 to race 0, and about a 2 to race 1. So the D14, it would be our best black shank resistance ever. It's also got black root rot resistance, which the D8 did not have. So this is one that it could be a good choice if you're looking to set tobacco early, say early May. We tend to see more black root rot. This has got resistance to black root rot there too. It should air cure pretty well, and I'll talk about it more here. It's probably most similar to a KTD6, with a few exceptions we'll talk about. But as far as the quality goes, we give all these varieties a relative yield score and a relative quality score. It's just on a 1 to 10 scale, and the 10 being the higher or the best, let's say. But like a D8 up here, we give it a 9 for yield potential, which is about as high as you'll see, but only about a 5 for quality. This D14 should be a little bit less yield potential, but still good. We give it an 8 for yield, and then a 7 for quality. So again, it's one that should be some pretty decent quality. Again, better than D8, but not quite as good as what you would see from like a Nerlick Dole or like a little Crittenden or some of those, or even like a 7319. But it's going to be on average, it'll be kind of middle of the pack as far as quality. Better than D8, probably better than 538 too, we feel like. But still, I've still got D4 listed here. D4 has been discontinued due to poor seed sales last year, but we still got D8. If you like D4, you still want to grow D4, I'd recommend you grow D8 because it's so much similar to it. But again, for black shank or for hot black shank, definitely think about D14 here, at least to try just a little bit of it anyway, see what you think of it. 558, I'll mention up here. That's from Newton Seed. It's been around for a while, but they've just got it re-released as a low converter LC variety, and so it's been in our trial for the last 4 or 5 years. 558. It's real similar to 538, except the quality is probably a little bit better, I feel like, than is the 538. But same kind of yield potential, same kind of black shank resistance. They're both solid black shank varieties, 538 and 558. But in terms of air cured quality, if you don't have black shank, you're thinking about things like 7312 has been great. That's the hybrid of the Nerleaf and 171. It's one that it comes to the top on quality for air cured tobacco, and also pretty good yield too. And so the D14, this is how it looks in the fistles. This is late season here, and this is a public variety from the UK UT breeding program. Dr. Bob Miller developed this, and it's been released actually last year, but we've got seed available this year from all the seed companies will have this D14 this year. Again, highest black shank risk we ever had for dark tobacco. A 10 to race 0 and a 5 to race 1. It's got root rot resistance, which is it's kind of an upgrade from the D8, having root rot resistance. A lot of folks have asked what the companies think about D14. And what we do before we release a variety is we have them come in, we give them a blind evaluation of about 15 varieties. It'll be air cured and also fire cured tobacco they look at. They don't know what they're looking at, but they'll give them a quality score for each flake, each stalk position, about 15 varieties before they're released. They'll look at, and they'll also have some standard varieties too that they'll look at too. And they're pretty good at picking out, like a Nearly Madole or like a little Crittenden. They can spot those. This D14, in those 15 varieties when they evaluated these, it ranked about 7 or 8 out of 15, which means it was right on average, I guess, in there, right in the, I guess what you call the median of quality for them. That was, we had UST, we had American Snuff Company, and we had Helen Cotton, and also Galton Regrind. They evaluated all of these. About every 2 years, we had to come in and do this. But it was about 7th or 8th, so not as good as like a narrow leaf or a little Crittenden or even like a PD variety, but better than a D8 or a 538 or some of those. So nothing really that they found really to be any kind of objection to this D14 at all. Of course, again, when they see a whole crop come in this year, you'll see more about it. But at least based on what we can tell on the variety evaluations we had them do, they didn't have any kind of major problem at all with D14. So it should be good to go from the company standpoint too. Again, it is most similar probably to D6. If you've grown D6 before, it'll be probably most similar to that with the exception of the maturity. It's going to be later maturity than D6. D6 is one that tends to spot up sometimes pretty quickly in about 5 weeks or so after topping. This should last at least a week longer than that. It doesn't have the 950 in the background like D6 did. And so that's where it got the early maturity, or what D6 got the early maturity and spotting potential is from that 950. This D14 doesn't have that, so it's going to last. It should last for 6 weeks anyway before you see a lot of specking up type of thing going on. But other than that, it looks probably more like a D6 than most anything else. And it's going to air cure probably, I think, a little better than D6 if you compare the quality scores on this over time. You'll see in some cases it looks a little bit better than D6 as far as air cured leaf quality. So again, it's one that looks pretty good. If you got black shank to deal with, the hotter black shank field, it's definitely the best we have for dark tobacco. A little bit of data here from Princeton. We have this trial annually, air cured variety trial at Princeton, where it's like the Burley variety trial show. This is all in one plot. We set it all at the same time, cut it at the same time, cured the same barn, and this was set early June. This past year, June 2nd, and we set dark at about 40 by 32, about 4,900 plants to the acre. 2-row plots, 40 foot long, so you're talking about 30 plants per plot, and we had 4 of them out there, so it's 120 plants there we're making the yield estimation from. This was cut middle of September, by mid-September, and we had a good curing season this year. I think you probably heard this. Most of the companies buying air cured tobacco have said this is probably one of the better air cured years they've seen in a long time. Especially if you look at the tobacco that was cut in September instead of October, it was a good curing season for most of it. We had most of all the anything you might be growing for air cured tobacco was in this plot here. Narrow leaf little Crittenden, 171, 359, the 538, 558, D6, D8, all the PD varieties, and then the D14. And then we had one experimental down here I won't talk much about. It's still 3 or 4 years down the road probably, but it was in this plot. We did have a lot of moisture in August at Princeton. We ended up having 9 inches or so in August. This plot here was on a good Kreider soil. That's a pretty well drained soil, kind of like a Pembroke type soil, and it was upslope too, so it wasn't at the bottom of the hill. So we didn't have much water damage at all in here, and it did well. This thing averaged about 3,500 pounds an acre across all 15 varieties based on small plot yields, and several of these went up in there close to 3,700. Narrowleaf Manoa 171, as well as 538, and then D6 and 7312, and that one experimental there too. But all of these were up over 3,100 anyway. The D14. Not quite as good a yield as the D6, but I think over time you'll see a lot of similarities to the yield potential of D6 and the quality too. The quality with air-cured, dark air-cured tobacco is different than burley. You'll see some true variety differences in dark that you won't see in burley. But last year, most everything, again, a good cured season. And most everything did well, didn't have much. A lot of times we'll see some weight index data for dark air cure that'll be down in the 20s, especially on varieties like D8 and 538. But these, everything was up in the 50s, except for 7302 was about 40. Everything else though was up over 50, most everything. And our highest quality here was 7312, and then the Narrowleaf Manoa over here, but again. Average about 53. Most of the time with dark air cure trial, if we get up into 40s on average, that's a good air curing season, you might say. We were up over 50 this year. So anyway, good quality on most everything. Even the D8 did well here, and 538 was up there and over 50, but above average. Now, a 3-year average, again, you learn a lot more, I think, about these if you look at them over time. This is from 2 locations, Springfield, Tennessee and Princeton, Kentucky, and over 3 years. And again, this was 2012 through 2014. Includes last year's data here. And this is just like that burley data I showed. The highest yielder is over here on the far left, and the lowest is down here on the far right. We're talking about 500 pounds really, from our lowest being 7309, our highest being D6. If you make out this is about 2741. This is about 3241 on D6. So D6, D8 are 2 top yielders for our dark air cure trials, and then you get on down in here. Some of the other, like little Crittenden and 359, some of those just don't have quite the yield potential as some of these other ones do, but good quality. But that's kind of how they stack up over multiple locations and over multiple years. The D14 is kind of right in the middle here. Again, not quite like the D6, but I think if you look at as you get more data to add to this, it'll look a little bit closer to D6. As far as yield, I think. This is the same 3-year average for quality here for the same 2 locations, Springfield, Tennessee, Princeton, Kentucky, over 2012, 2014. Highest quality here on the far left and lowest on the far right. And then we've got 7312 over here, 7309, a little Crittenden, 7318, and also Narrowleaf, all those up over 40. Again, the D14 here, a lot like D6 as far as quality, but if you look at some of these trials, individual trials, it looks a little bit better. But in this, it's about the same as the D6 here. The D8 was our lowest on average, and then of course 538, a little bit lower than that. But these kind of break out. You see some that are about 3 or 4 together, and they kind of go down, and then about 4 or 5 in here that are about the same. But there's some distinctive differences in these dark air cured varieties when you look at the quality, even when all things are equal. A little bit of black shank data here from a plot we have at Hopkinsville every year, and we've been doing this plot for the last 9 years in the same spot every year since 2006. In 2006, it was already a pretty hot site, but it was mostly race 0 black shank, because if we were to put a 7318 or a 7302 or a 7309 in there, they would look just about immune to black shank. You would have 90% stands or better through the year. It took about 3 years for that to change, and us to see a lot more race 1 in there. And And now, if you put 7302 or 7309 or 7318 in there, you'll see it might look kind of like a nearly double as far as having a lot of black shank loss because of a lot more race 1 black shank. Again, those are you're going to be immune to race 0, but they have nothing to race 1. And just like 14L8 Burley, if you got a black shank field you put these into, you always have a little bit of race 1 in there. And if you totally shut down the race 0, it's going to cause the race 1 to really grow in a hurry. And without rotation and without rhythm meal like in this site, it takes about 3 years to really see a lot more race 1 come in. If you rotate good, it's going to take longer than that, obviously. But in this situation, about 3 years is all it took to see a lot more race 1 to really grow. So every year we go in here with a black shank variety trial. We're trying to really look at some of these private varieties more to kind of verify what the black shank resistance levels are in them. And so we always set some narrow leaf in there that's got no resistance to give us an overall idea about how hot the black shank is. Most races of black shank, and then I always want to have one of these race indicator varieties, I call it, like 7318. It's just a 10 to race 0, totally immune to race 0, but nothing to race 1. That's going to tell you how hot the race 1 is there. You got 558 we had this past year. It's a solid 4 to both races. 7305, that's just a fire cure variety, but it's got some pretty good race 1 black shank resistance too. And 7319, a 10 and a 2. Our D14 here was a 10 and a 5. And then we had 2 experimentals there. One of them is called a D14, but it's not the same KT D14 as you'll be able to have this year to grow. It's a different D14. That's just an entry number there. And then there was a D15 here too. But they're both immune to race 0. We're not sure what the race 1 resistance is. That's why we put them in this plot to get a better idea about your race 1 resistance. So what this is, we go out there, we set the plot, and then we go in there and we take stand counts about every 2 or 3 weeks to see how many plants we're losing the black shank throughout the whole season. And the most important one, of course, is at the end of the year, right before you cut the tobacco. That's your most important stand count. And at the bottom of this is what that last stand count is. And of course, you got narrow leaf over here that could have been, you've very well been a 0 stand left. We have about 16% of the narrow leaf left now. And then you got 7318, which, looking back, if you looked at this same plot in 2007, the 7318, it might have been a 95% stand. And now it's about 23% stand. Just because of a lot more race 1 black shank in there now than it was then. 558, a solid black shank variety to both races, about an 80% stand there. 7305 did well. And then 7319, though, didn't do quite as well, though. But we're talking about here, 7319 has got a 2 to race 1. And then 7305 has got a 3 to race 1. So you're talking about a 2 versus a 3 there. And we had over twice the stand. It usually isn't that big of a difference most time, but this past year it seemed to be. There was that much of a difference between a 2 and a 3 here. Our D14 here was the first time we've ever seen one really stand up and didn't lose a plant the whole year in this plot. We had 100% stand of the D14. Normally in this trial it's about a 95%, which is still great, but this year we had 100% stand of the D14, and of course that gave it the highest yield because it didn't have any stand loss there too. One thing about black shank is you'll notice, even if we don't get a lot of stand loss, you get some stunning. If that's where the rhythm meal comes in a lot of times. I'd say the easiest tool to use against black shank is the resistant variety. But the rhythm meal and other fungicides will help that some too to prevent some yield loss. In some of these plots like this, you'll see where our stands were very good. We had a 90% stand or better, but it might have lost maybe 500 pounds off the yield potential because it was still being challenged and stressed by black shank. And so again here, if this was a black shank free field, a clean field, you might have saw an extra 300 pounds or so on this D14. Even though we had 100% stand, it probably didn't reach its full potential because of being challenged by that much race with the black shank there and having to spend energy in fighting it off. Now, any questions about varieties so far before I move on into something different here? So again, one new variety, D14. I'll also mention before we get into this, and I may already have a slide later on, but there's a new fungicide that will be available too. We've been having a guy from Valent come to about every meeting to really kind of introduce it. He couldn't make it up here this week, but there's a new fungicide called Presidio from Valent that it just got registered for tobacco here about a month ago, and it's got approval for Kentucky too, and I'll show you some data on it too. But I haven't done much work with it myself, but the data I've seen looks really good. Presidio, it's going to be labeled for use in the settle order and also after set. It's kind of like the Ridamil is, but they're going to still recommend you to keep using Ridamil at least one time in there, and that's in other words, use the Presidio in the settle order. It's going to be 4 ounces per acre will be the base application rate for this new fungicide Presidio. It'll be 4 ounces an acre. And then come in there, if you want to use more, you'll use Ridamil at your first cultivation at the same pints you've been using in the past, and then you can come in again at, say, lay-by time and spray 4 ounces Presidio again. And all the data that I've seen, it looks comparable to Ridamil as far as if you were to compare 3 shots of Ridamil, 8 ounces of Ridamil in the settle water, and then a pint at the first cultivation and a pint at the last cultivation. Your black shank control from this Presidio, this mix with Ridamil, is real similar to that. And again, we'll have a lot more data about that this coming year. We're going to have some plots with it, but it's one to look for if you're looking for. It'll be quite a bit cheaper than Ridamil because the rate's lower. I think probably the cost per ounce is about the same, but the rate's about half what you would use for Ridamil. And so the cost will be, I don't know, double digits cheaper per acre, they say. I'm not sure about the exact price of it because the rate's it's much lower. It's going to be a cheaper price to use. But they still want you to use some Ridamil with it because of resistance management. There's some potential there for black shank to kind of mutate and develop some resistance against this stuff, and so they still want you to use some Ridamil with it. And again, Ridamil is still a great product. There's no resistance we've found to Ridamil. It still works great, and but it's one that definitely this is a new product that we're excited about. Presidio, Presidio. But look for that this year, and I may have some data on later on in here. But again, all the data that I've seen, if it's used in a direct comparison to Ridamil, it looks pretty similar as far as the control goes. Now, a little bit about fertilization. We've been doing some work with potash here the last couple of years, and this is an area where, as we get a little bit leaner as far as input costs go up, but maybe prices, especially for barley, are kind of starting to stabilize or go down. Maybe we're thinking about ways to save some cost as far as the input cost on the back. And if you look at the soil tests that we get, at least that are run through UK Soil Lab, about 2/3 of the soil tests we get from Kentucky tobacco fields, we're going to say no additional phosphate needed. It's already got plenty of phosphorus in the soil for that tobacco crop that year. And about 1/3 of those will say no potash needed. So those two, again, if you, and those are very conservative recommendations too. I mean, you can bet, and I'll show you some data here that kind of supports this. If it says 0 potash, or if it says 0 phosphorus, you can bet that you've got plenty there, at least for this tobacco crop this year. Now, it's not it isn't any kind of long-term soil building kind of thing over time. That's where your private labs come in. If you send a sample to waters, or you have samples run through a private applicator or something, they're going to go through Waters Lab or A&L, and they'll almost always recommend some P&K, but they're looking at a different philosophy than we do at UK. They're looking at 5-year soil building kind of thing. Well, we're just looking at just what you need for this year, and then we expect you to soil test again for next year. But again, most of these, a lot of them, especially if you got a good row crop rotation, they'll say 0 phosphorus there, and about 1/3 of them will say 0 potash. If you need to use some P and K, as you already know, I think it's cheaper to get them in the fall and put them out in the fall. The rates there are based on soil test, unlike nitrogen, where the nitrogen rate is based on cropping history and about soil drainage class. Our P and K is based on the soil that was actually in that soil test. Now, the phosphorus, it can range from 0 to about 230 pounds of actual phosphorus per acre. And the potash is going to depend on the type. Now, burley will use more potash than dark wheat, actually. And it can go up to about 400 pounds of actual potassium for burley, and the recommendation may get up to about 300 pounds of actual potash for dark. A lot of folks are asking about using muriate of potash, which is 0060, potassium chloride. And it's fine to use on tobacco in the fall for sure. Before January the 1st, you can use as much as you like, but after January 1st, you really can't use much at all. And in fact, it's going to be limited to no more than 50 pounds of chloride per acre. Now, muriate has got about 47, 48 pounds of chloride per 100 pounds. And so if you put out 100 pounds of 0060, you get almost 50 pounds of chloride per acre. So if you're going to use if you think about using muriate after the 1st of January, that's about all you can use legally. It's about 100 pounds per acre, which most of the time, if you need potash out there, you're going to need more than that probably. But that's how much you can use to keep that chloride level in check. If it were to rain a whole lot in April, you might could use more than that, but we don't know that. And so we're recommending no more than about 100 pounds of 060 after January the 1st. And the biggest thing about it is, especially for air-cured tobacco, is chloride. If we get over about 1% chloride in the cured leaf, it's going to be some cured problems, moisture problems in there. It's hard to get it to dry down. You get a lot of off colors, off smell and aroma too in there. So that's the biggest thing about it, the biggest risk. But as far as fall applications, you put out all you need to, and it's going to be considerably cheaper than sulfate of potash. 0050 is still our preferred potash source, but it's getting to be a little bit tougher to find. It seems like at least the last 2 years it was. It may not be up here, but as you go further west, we're seeing, I think, at least some short-term shortages of it. Where we got it, I think, but it took a few weeks to get sulfate of potash in last spring, and so some of the dealers were offering things like K-Mag, which is 0022 instead. Also, they're pushing this like a rainbow complete fertilizer. That's a 612-18 that has got micronutrients also in it, but considerable cost involved with that too. So if you're thinking about 0060 versus sulfate of potash, you can probably count on at least a $250 per ton difference in the cost, with the muriate being cheaper. But it needs to be a fall application, basically, if you want to use the muriate. A little bit about just symptoms of, this is pretty rare to see on the back of phosphate deficiency. This is what it looks like. I can tell you we had, 2 years ago we had quite a bit, probably more than I've seen in the last 10 years, but it was still probably wasn't more than a couple dozen cases of this in our lab. But it shows up as just, it's usually on your pretty small tobacco, because one of the first nutrients that these plants take up is going to be phosphorus. But if it's short, it's going to be kind of pale yellow, and you'll see kind of some bronze-looking spots on it, kind of sporadic, usually on about the second oldest leaf from the bottom there. But again, pretty rare to see this. Most of these soils have a lot of phosphorus in them, and a lot of times it can be kind of a temporary thing to see this. But even with a temporary deficiency, it's pretty rare to see phosphorus deficiency, because most of these soils have plenty out there, and then you're adding some more on top of that most of the time, so it's usually not an issue. Now, potassium deficiency is more common to see, but most of the time it's going to be temporary. You may see this kind of thing where you've got some yellowing leaf tips here along the margin of the leaf too, on burley and dark tobacco. It can be a short-term temporary thing that may only last 10 days. If it was real dry, and then you finally got a rainfall, it may go away if you got plenty of potash there, but you can have plenty of potassium in the soil and still get this temporarily under the right conditions. Usually if it turns off dry is where you'll see this, because potassium is going to move into the plant on soil solution. So it's got to have, it's got to be in water to be taken up. It's sitting there real dry. You just can't take it up until you get some moisture in it. It's not uncommon to see that on just a short-term temporary basis. This is a shot of burley, a mild symptom of potassium deficiency. On dark, sometimes you might get some longer-term potassium deficiency, that you see some tissue loss here, the same thing, but this may be an actual deficiency and not a temporary thing. Now, one thing we try to do to kind of verify our potassium recommendations is do some potassium work, where we try to find a site that is actually low in potash, which is pretty hard to find, honestly. A lot of these places we look at, they've got so high potash levels anyway that you're not ever going to see a response to adding potash. But we have found our site, a good site in our classic Murray, at Murray State. The last 3 years, actually, the potash levels have gone down to where the soil test is saying that they're in the medium to low range. And so it's been recommending about 200 pounds or more of potash. And so a good place to do some potash research here on dark tobacco. In this past year, we took a soil test, ran it through our lab. It came back a soil test K level of about 212, which would be in the medium to low range. The soil test called for 190 pounds of potash per acre, which is quite a bit. We had one where I guess it was 2 years ago, the same site called for 260, and then the year before that it called for 290. So it has been one that's got a little bit better over time, but this has been in a 4-year rotation with soybeans, and so it's something that it's got a good rotation, but still pretty low potash levels there that we're seeing. So we want to do some research there. We always want to put a check out there where anything you're looking at, you want to make sure you got a check where you don't you got something to compare it to. A lot of times we look at something, anything, a foliar application of something where you're spraying the whole field and just comparing it to another field maybe. If you can put that check in that same field, you have a lot better opportunity to see a true difference, if there is one to be seen, if it's in the same field. Now this is actually just like our variety trials, where we've got 4 plots of each of these treatments out there, and one of them is a check that gets no potassium at all. So it's calling for 190, and that check got 0. So we made that 190 pounds of potash our normal X rate, you might say, recommended rate, will be 190. Then we want to compare, if you cut that by 50%, if you only put out 95 pounds, will that make a difference in the yield potential of this, or the quality, or any of that? Or if you went up, if you put out, say, 50% more than the recommended rate, what would that do? A lot of folks think that we don't recommend enough, and so they're going to put out, add 50% to what we recommend. And so we did that here. We had 95, we had 190, and then we had 285. And then we had it in 2 different application times. We had it all broadcast before setting the tobacco. The day before setting, we put out a broadcast application and worked it in. Or we come in there and made a banded application about a week after setting the tobacco at the same 3 rates here. So we want to compare again the effect of the timing of that potash application, and also the rate within each of those times. This whole plot got the same nitrogen and the same phosphorus. The soil test called for about 100 pounds of phosphorus per acre. We put that out pre-transplant. It got 275 pounds of nitrogen out there. And then the only thing that changed by the plots was the potash rates at the time. So if you look at this, it's the yield of this. We've got the 0 control over here. We've got the 3 rates as a broadcast application on the day before setting the tobacco, and then the banded application at about a week after setting the tobacco here. And there is some response to potash. There should be. If we're, if we're recommending 190 pounds, there definitely should be some response there compared to a 0 rate. And there is some, if you put out anything at all, you get some response, but it's not a whole lot. It's not as much as you would expect it to be. In some cases, it may be as little as say 50 pounds here compared to the check. So again, that's something to be said about our recommendations versus adding more. If you look at if you increase the rate above that 190, we really don't see much of an increase in the yield at all. If you look at the banded application versus broadcast application, it really didn't matter, how you put it out. If you got it out there within a week after setting as a band, it seemed to be fine. But there was some small response. If you didn't put out any potash versus putting out any rate, there is some small response there. Not a whole lot, not as much as you would expect it to be. So this kind of goes on to tell you that if you put out more than a recommended rate based on UK soil test, that's some money that you could be saving for sure. Now this is if you just took an average over all three of those rates and just compared if we put out all three rates broadcast versus banded a week after setting, this is the effect of the application timing here. This is the broadcast pre-transplant. This is the band a week after setting here. And we're talking about 15, 17 pounds difference there and all. It didn't matter about the rate much, it didn't matter about the timing of application. If you compare the rates here, the same story. It didn't matter whether you put out half the recommended rate or the recommended rate or went 50% above that. There's a few pounds there, but hey, you're only talking about, what is that, 50 pounds or so as you went from the half rate up to 150%.
Was this conventional?
Yes.
How many pounds would it be cultivated?
This was cultivated twice. Yeah. And the first time came in and said we put the potash out as a band, and we cultivated that in right behind that. Then cultivated it again about 2 weeks after that. So 1 and then 3 or 4 weeks after setting, we cultivated twice. So again, it's a situation where you really don't see much of an effect of adding, more potash than needed for sure. I would say definitely when you put out what's recommended here, definitely no real reason to go above that. And according to this data, you can go less than our recommendation and still be okay. Definitely, no reason to go above that recommendation. A little bit about some folks ask about micronutrients from time to time, and really, we don't see a whole lot of effect of micronutrients on tobacco that we feel are really important. We see some odd things once in a while, some calcium deficiencies. This is something you see once in a while with burley, where it can be mistaken for like a 2,4-D drip sometimes. It looks a little bit like that. Up in the top of the plant, the growing point gets kind of twisted a little bit there. You see some of those sharper leaf tips, but this is actually calcium deficiency and not 2,4-D injury. A few of the older burley varieties were a little bit more prone to do this, like KD200, but it was one you really don't see. This is pretty rare to see this, and it's almost always temporary. If you look at the soil levels for calcium, it's going to be, the index for calcium is like, oftentimes like 2,800 to 3,000, and there's plenty of calcium in a lot of these in there. So something you don't see very often, but it's something you may see that can be confused with phenoxy type herbicide injury. But as far as trying to spray a foliar spray that's got calcium in to prevent something like this is not something that is really going to cause any kind of a yield loss either. So it's something we don't see a whole lot of response to a foliar calcium application that you might think. And that's the case for most of the foliar fertilizer that we tested. Really, you just don't see a whole lot of yield response in those. So you might see, like on the settle water applications, you may see some short-term growth for a couple of weeks, and then after about 4 weeks, everything kind of levels out. You can't tell what got the starter and what didn't. We hardly, and we never see a yield impact of those, at least the ones that we've tested.
Dry weather, have to bring that on.
Bring this on, yeah, that's another one that kind of like the potash. You'll see more of this thing in dry weather. You get a rainfall, and you may see that clear up. It's almost always temporary. Yeah, they're using way up there, and so it's just a matter of getting up to the plant. And, 200 was real bad about this, but most of the newer varieties we're growing now, you don't see them as much there, but it's something that might show up. The difference in it is it's like compared to a 2,4-D drift type injury on this, it won't be as severe as 2,4-D for one thing, but then also you may see a few plants in there that look to be unaffected on the calcium, and with 2,4-D you'll see some in about every plant. You'll see some of that kind of response. Now, about the only micronutrient that we see as being a problem in tobacco, and it's not so much here as it is further west, but will be boron. Boron is one that we are seeing more boron deficiency on tobacco. I think I've talked about this before a little bit up here, but it's one that we're seeing occasionally in this area, where the biggest thing about it is going to be leaf breakage. Leaves just popping off about 2 inches off the stalk, using in mid-stalk positions there to lower stalk positions. You may see some bud damage prior to that happening. That should be the first thing you see with boron, will be a twisted yellow, kind of pale-looking bud there. But you may see some leaves breaking off too. If you cut that stalk right, you may find a little hollow spot in there. That you don't always see that I'm not sure if it's always there or not, but if you don't cut the right angle, you might not find that. But it's one that's also a symptom of this boron deficiency. Usually that'll be within 4 to 5 inches off the bud where you see that little hollow spot there. Now, one thing about boron, it's very pH dependent, which isn't much of an issue up here. We don't see real high pHs up here a lot of the time, but further west, you go out to the purchase area, out in Callaway, Graves County, they see more higher pH. If it gets up to 7 or even 6.9 sometimes, your boron becomes less available to tobacco. It doesn't take a whole lot of boron, but once it gets up to about 7, it can't take up much at all, and so you'll see this coming in. But in some cases, it's also low soil boron levels too, on top of high pH, and then you get, of course, more of a deficiency symptom showing up. As far as plant boron levels here, if you get up to about 30 ppm in the plant, that's about the threshold, I think, for boron. If you get less than that, there may be deficiency showing up. If you get below 20, for sure, you may see some. But again, you may have plenty of boron in the soil, but if you got a pH of 7 or 7.5 in this case, there could be some deficiency showing up for boron. On dark tobacco, some of the same kind of thing. This is, you see the bud here. This is on some tobacco that was not much past lay-by, about knee-high, a little bit better than knee-high. Up in the bud here, kind of a twisted bud, a little bit pale too, and some brown there too. If you were to put your finger in that, those little small leaves an inch long, they just kind of pop off there. But that's a real symptom of this boron deficiency. But sometimes you may not see that and just see the leaves breaking off later on. It's always about 2 inches off the stalk. And also on the back of that leaf, on this picture, you'll see kind of a scabby looking look to it here. You see a little bit of brown right there where it's kind of scabby looking back there for 3 or 4 inches up the bottom of that midrib there on the back side of that leaf. And then it breaks off right in the middle of where it looks so scabby. On the dark, in this case, this is one from Graves County, where pH was high and plant boron was low, and also soil boron was low too. pH 7.3, it had bud damage, it had leaf breakage early on in the season, but sometimes you may not see the bud damage, or you may not notice the bud damage, and just get the leaves popping off later on, and that's it could be some timing effects on this, where early on it may be getting enough boron, then later on in the season it may not be getting enough, and you get some leaves popping off there. But in this case, a pH 7.3, a plant boron about 14 parts per million, and some definite boron deficiency there. But we should recommend you can spray boron if you think you've got some of this. You may not. You want to make sure that this is probably what you've got. If you see it leaves popping off right at the stalk, it could be some other things. It could. We've seen that from offshoot tea sucker plucker mixed too hot, it can cause some leaf shear right at the stalk. We've seen where you get some skunk damage in there. Skunks looking for hornworms on the back, and they'll break leaves off right at the stalk. It's not out here about 2 inches off the stalk. In this case, you got leaves breaking 2 inches off the stalk. On the back side, you'll see a scabby look to it, and you may have seen a twisted bud early on before that too. And then again, you may cut that stalk open and find a little hollow stalk in there too, a little hollow spot in there. But you can spray boron. We recommend a 1/4 pound of actual boron is our standard rate of application, and you want to find a product that's going to give you enough boron to get that 1/4 pound. Now, some of these, like soluble, is probably the best one to give you that 1/4 pound as far as it's about 20% boron, and so you put out about 1.5 pounds of soluble, and it'll give you that 1/4 pound of actual boron per acre pretty easily. It can be sprayed. It's going to mix with whatever you're spraying well, and it can be sprayed and go in the setter water also. So when you put it out, it can be in the fertilizer. Just make sure it's in the fertilizer that it's in a pellet form, and so it's going to mix well with your fertilizer pellet, your pre-fertilizer pellets. It's a real fine granule, and so it's got to be in a form that is going to mix with fertilizer if you're going to put it out that way. But it can be sprayed, it can be in the setter water, either way. But a 1/4 pound is kind of the center recommendation that we have for boron on the back. It isn't something you want to think about spraying, just arbitrarily spraying every week or something, because there is some toxicity risk with boron, where normally we're talking about spraying 1/4 to 1/2 pound and no more than twice in the season you can spray it. That's about the limit of it. Now, this past year we had a pretty good plot. Your boron can be pretty streaky to where you'll have maybe a place in the field where you have a few rows, 4, 5, 6 rows, you see quite a bit of leaf breaking off, and then right next to it you may not see hardly any. So it's hard to put a test out in a spot like that. We found a pretty good place over in Graves County this past year where we did a boron test here. We've been tracking this field for about 2 years now, where since 2012, in soybeans, it showed some pretty good boron deficiency there in the beans. And then last year in 2013 on tobacco. And then the guy came back into tobacco in 2014, and so we put a test out there. In this case, it had a really high pH, which you might never see up in this area, but it had a 7.6 on pH, and then also had some low soil boron levels there. We set Semi 309 in late June, and we wanted to compare transplant water applications of boron to foliar applications of boron. I mentioned you can put soluble in the setter water. In this case, we used Borisol, which is a liquid boron product. It's got 10% boron in it. It weighs about 11 pounds in a gallon, and so every gallon of Borisol, you get about 1.1 pounds of boron. So we want to compare that 1/4 pound rate of actual boron to 1/2 pound of boron, and then to a full pound of boron in the setter water, and also as a foliar spray at about 4 weeks after setting. So what we did, we had this in setter water simulations at about 120 gallons per acre in the setter water, and the 3 rates of Borisol that we used to get that 1/4 pound or that 1/2 pound or that 1 pound of actual boron, that amounted to about 29 ounces of Borisol to get a 1/4 pound, or 58 ounces to get a 1/2 pound, or 116 ounces to get a full pound. We had that again in setter water simulations or as a foliar spray. A setter water simulation is where we set the tobacco and then went to each plant right after setting and put that right amount, which is about 5 ounces per plant to each plant there in these plots. And it's actually about 3 3/4 ounces per plant to get 120 gallons per acre based on this plant population, which is about 4,900 plants an acre. So we're talking about setter water simulation versus foliar. And what we saw in here with the setter water, I mentioned you could use a 1/4 pound or a 1/2 pound. I know foliar, we weren't sure about the setter water, and weren't sure about boresol either, as far as if there's more toxicity risk based on boresol versus soluble. We tested soluble as a foliar, and we sprayed soluble up to 2 pounds over, I mean, not at one time, but say a quarter pound sprayed 8 times in the field and didn't see toxicity. But with boresol in the setter water, we did see some toxicity where we get a lot of burning, a lot of plant loss. This is the response we saw to the setter water and to the foliar spray. Again, the setter water simulation here, we went the quarter pound, the half pound, the full pound. This is the total yield here across the top. And as we increase the rate there from that quarter pound to a half pound to a full pound, in a setter water type application, we saw a lot more plant loss, a lot of toxicity there. As you get over a quarter pound, really, it was a problem. Now, the foliar application at the same rates at about 3.5 weeks after setting, we saw just the opposite response. As you increase the rate, we saw increased yield, we saw less boron deficiency symptoms as you sprayed it there versus in the setter water. The setter water, again, going over a quarter pound, we saw some pretty major injury. But as you increase rate as a foliar spray with this boresol, we saw some positive response. But again, if you're thinking about, if you compare the yields here, the total yields, a full pound of boron as a foliar spray was about equivalent to the quarter pound in the setter water. But if you go above a quarter pound, we saw some major problems here in setter water. So there's one definitely now when we say, if you're going to use boron in setter water, don't use more than a quarter pound. If you're going to spray it, I'd still probably stick to more than, say, a half pound as a spray, but then more than a quarter pound in the setter water. And again, the first thing is to make sure you've got boron deficiency, but this is just, how we have kind of developed recommendations here over time for folks that have some boron deficiency. This is just comparing all three of those rates, just the setter water versus foliar spray, and again, this is all three rates average over each other, and the difference here is just based on all the injury we got. We went to a quarter to the half pound and the full pound in the setter water compared to a foliar spray. Probably overall, we saw a better yield over the rates with a foliar spray, but you're fine, I think, with a quarter pound in the setter water, not more than that. If you compare the rates there, again, because of the setter water injury, as you increase rate there up to a pound, we saw less yield, but that's just based on that setter water injury that we saw. So again, overall, don't use more than a quarter pound of boron, actual boron, in the setter water. You can spray up to say a half a pound at a foliar. Now, one thing I'll kind of finish up on here a little bit as far as future developments. Is anybody going on transplants here in the room? Anybody going on plants? I might as well skip this. Okay, all right, Frank is. But the one thing you may have seen of these new trays, that'll probably be, I'd say next year anyway, you'll see more of these solid plastic trays that these things are pretty stout. I mean, this is something that you may see. I think Jim Bill McKay has got a few of these now. There'll be a few more coming in March, but this is something that you may see more of next year. It's a solid plastic tray that this thing weighs about 3 pounds as compared to a styrofoam tray that weighs less than a half a pound. But it does float. It's got these, the way it's built on the bottom, this is all one piece, but the way it's built at the bottom, each sail is kind of hollowed out in there, and it's going to kind of trap air in there so it'll float on water. It doesn't feel like it'll float, but it does. It needs to be set on the water flat, though. If you kind of throw it around like a styrofoam tray, if it lands like that, it's going to kind of float like that. It's got to land. It's got to be set on there flat, but it does float. But I'll pass this around. If you haven't seen it before, you have to look at it. But it's something that the biggest issue with a styrofoam tray is getting them clean and also disposing of them. There's no good way to get rid of the things, and And also, if you're, we're saying that you shouldn't keep styrofoam trays more than about 3 or 4 years, because they're going to get, as you get roots growing into them, they're going to be, a lot of pythium carryover is a main thing we see with them. This is a tray here that can be cleaned a lot better, but it's one that if you're growing plants to sell, it's one that you definitely want to, get these trays back. But a lot of folks are thinking about, well, if you're doing that, you may have the customer buy the trays himself, his own trays himself, and bring them to you to go to the plant store, and he can clean them too, maybe when he brings them back. But it's one that may be coming. It depends on how things go this year. It's something that, again, the biggest thing about these trays here is we can disinfect them almost completely compared to a styrofoam tray, but we can't, and they're totally recyclable. These are. And they're saying these things may last 15, 20 years. It could be the last tray you buy, but they're more expensive, of course, instead of time. We're talking about, these are probably weigh or cost about $6 or $7 a tray, compared to a styrofoam tray being $1.90 to $2 a tray. But if they'll last 20 years, it may be economical, to use them. But the question is, if you're growing plants to sell, how do you deal with the trays? Getting them back, or do you have the customer buy this tray, that kind of thing. But it's something you may see, and they're also making this in white. Also, we're going to do some work on these this spring at Princeton in our greenhouse. But being black like that, I think you probably will see some faster germination, probably by a couple of days anyway. They're going to have them in, I think, white also. But everything I've seen so far, they've done a lot of work on them in Virginia, and the data that I've seen, it looks good. As far as storing these trays, I wouldn't leave them in like an open greenhouse for the whole summer, because the heat, it's got some UV protection in there, but the heat can still, probably deform them some. But you want to leave them kind of covered up, I would say, over the summer if you store them. But they say they can last 15, 20 years. But again, the cost will be the difference. You're talking about $6.50 or so for that tray versus $2 for a styrofoam EPS tray. So I'm going to stop there. This is my contact information. You can get in touch with me through Kerry or directly, either way. We got a Dark Tobacco website there that's got, I think, almost all this data that I've shown is on there. We're also on Facebook, a Facebook page called Dark Tobacco in Kentucky and Tennessee, and then my contact information down there. But any questions about varieties or about black shank or about these trays? Like I say, we don't know much about these trays yet. We're going to do some work this spring with them at Princeton, and also Presidio fungicide coming. We'll have some plots out with this year too. We don't have much data yet, but all the data I've seen other people have, it looks pretty good. So it's one to think about. If you got black shank, think about this new fungicide. Any questions at all about anything we talked about? Everybody sign in, I guess, up here for the, yes, it's for me here, but I think Kerry was going to go and get fish, I think, at 11:30 or 11:20 or something like that. Anyway, we can just have some discussion if y'all like. Just hang out until she gets back to lunch. Chill, all right. I'll chill my voice then.
In fields where you haven't seen function, would a high resistance variety of tobacco, can you replace that with expensive fungicides?
Let's see, could you replace the better resistance with fungicides in a field that doesn't have much black shank in it? You probably could. Yeah, you probably could. And in some cases, for burley especially, you might get by without red meal. anymore. If you've got a field that doesn't have much black shank, and you got something that's like a 209 or even a 206, it's got some pretty good race 1 resistance to it too. You might get by without fungicides at all. It's a variety, but probably the variety is the easiest and the strongest way to prevent black shank. So if you could do one or the other, I would do that.
I grow all dark, and I'm moving to a darker farm next year, but next season it's only Thursday back.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering if we move to the new 8D14, when shall we do that?
If you don't expect to see black shank, and especially with D14, I wouldn't bother with the fungicide unless you've got some. Unless you got some, a lot of black shank in other fields where you may have tracked it in there you don't know about.
I haven't seen it for 10, 11 years ago.
Yeah. So I would just try it without it. I mean, if you want some cheap insurance, I would try. We do even in fields where we don't expect to see black shank, we're still putting 4 ounces of Ridmeal or even 6 ounces in a setter water, and that's a little bit of cheap. That'll help with pythium too, but. If there was a touch of black shank, that might help with that. It's cheap enough to where it's not a big cost to you. But you may not have to use it at all.